William Egginton is the Decker Professor in Humanities, the Director of the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute, and Chair of Modern Languages and Literature at Johns Hopkins University. He's the author of many books, including this one, The Rigor of Angels, Borges, Heisenberg, Kant, and the Ultimate Nature of Reality, which we're going to discuss today. So, William Egginton, thank you very much indeed for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
This book I found difficult to classify. It does focus on three great men. So we've got Borges, we've got Heisenberg, and we've also got Immanuel Kant. And I suppose the first question has to be is, what links Borges, Heisenberg, and Kant from your point of view?
Right. So thank you. It is a curious collection. And I think the idea of the book for a long time was to write about not those particular three characters, but the question that ultimately I discovered that or led me to each of them, a question about how human beings cognize, come to understand what reality is. And there were many other possible candidates to be the lead characters, so to speak, in this book. It's a book that spans some 2,500 years of cultural and intellectual history of the West. And I think in some first iterations of my thinking about the book, there were many different characters, maybe 12 chapters, each with a central character. And then I felt that it spread a little bit too thin, that I needed something to draw it all back together. And at one point, I reeled it in all the way to one central character. I was thinking of Boethius, who does play he's a 4th century now Italian thinker, Roman patrician. Great philosopher. And then I was thinking that this is really too focused on one person. And then so I let it blow back out again. And I thought, well, three. And there's a wonderful history of people writing books that are somewhere in between a kind of tripartite biography and dealing with big philosophical issues. Primarily among those is Gödel Bach by Douglas Hofstadter.
I wondered if that had influenced your
it did. The form did. The form, although the kind of book that he ended up writing really was, I would say, sort of, it's more brilliant kind of speculative work that touches on these different characters in their lives. It doesn't have as much of the lives of his three protagonists as mine does in the end. And then I was puzzling, because I would like to do this. I had written an intellectual biography before, and the style that I write, I'm much less biographer than really thinking about the ideas in question. And that was a book about Cervantes that I published in 2016 that was called The Man Who Invented Fiction. That was really about what fiction is and how it could be that our understanding of modern fiction was really brought about largely by the work of one man 400 years ago in kind of the waning years of the Spanish Empire. And then I thought, okay, this is a genre of writing that I like, that I'm drawn to, connecting people and places with the ideas that they produce. Then I thought, really, well, who are these three people going to be? Well, they have to be from radically different disciplines, and that's where a physicist, a poet, and a philosopher kind of came to my mind, that would be a perfect combination, an exciting, a stimulating combination. And then I realized, it sort of hit me, that 10 years earlier, at the time when I was writing, I had actually published a piece in the New York Times in their philosophy forum that's known as The Stone, and that piece was about exactly these three thinkers. So I was answering my own question from 10 years. That was my voice calling myself, reminding me, tapping me on the shoulder and saying, hey, dummy, you've already actually picked these three characters. Here they are. And then it became time to do the hard work because I'd written about, their ideas, their mathematics, and in Heisenberg's case, the way his stories deal with mathematical conundra in Borges's case, and the philosophy behind the two in Kant's case. But I hadn't touched at all in this very piece on who they were as people. So then came the mountain to climb of doing all the biographical and historical research to get me to the point of writing the book. The ideas and the questions were there, and I knew that there was something uniting these three intellectually, but I wanted to then see how the stories of their lives and the places and times that they were writing in would weave together, and they ended up weaving, I think, together rather well. So I was happy.
I mean, it does come over rather well, and you do weave together, I think, very, very cleverly the background information, Borges and his difficulties with his paramour Nora, and also Heisenberg and his difficulties with Germany at the time, and Kant too. But also you've got the fundamental issue really is the ideas and weaving those ideas together, which I think you've done in a very very clever way, very sophisticated way as well, which comes over cleverly. But they all have something to say, from what I can see, about the nature of reality, which is why your subtitle is about reality.
That's exactly right.
Can we look at each of these
Course.
three strands separately and try to look at what they each give us an insight into reality itself? I mean, do you want to start with Borges?
Let's start with Borges. It's a great place to start. In some ways, I like to say that what was the proof of concept for this book for me was that I learned to understand Kant, and then even more kind of shockingly, quantum mechanics best by reading Borges. And so that's what I try to get across.
That's
By
a
reading Borges. No, and when I start, when I teach a course at Hopkins on poets, physicists, philosophers, and the ultimate nature of reality, in which we explore a lot of the primary texts together with students that led to this book. And what my elevator pitch for the course to my colleagues is that this is the foundations, the poetic and philosophical foundations of quantum mechanics and relativity, because I also do Einstein in that class, and Einstein, as you know, is a big character in this book as well. But
well, there were a lot of characters which I found. I mean, there's Parmenides and Socrates.
It goes as far back as Parmenides. That's exactly right, and yeah, and up to some contemporary philosophers in the 20th century. So we definitely move around the historical map quite a bit. But Borges is the way that I'll start that course. And in fact, I started almost like in a kindergarten setting, saying, close your eyes, I'm going to read you a story. And the story that I read them, which takes about 10 minutes to read out loud, is Borges's story, one of the lead-off stories from his collections, two collections of fictions in the early 1940s. It's called Funeste Memorias in translation. And I speculate, as many have, that Borges was inspired by stories that were circulating at the time of a mnemist in Moscow by the name of Solomon Cheryshev, who it was reported had kind of surpassed all previous known bounds of capacity of memory, and was being tested by great neuroscientists, including Alexander Luria at the time.
This was a guy who had a photographic memory and could recall pretty well everything he saw.
Absolutely everything. It didn't send Luria, the great neuroscientist, who would then be influential for people like Oliver Sacks many years later. He claimed as a young researcher that when he tested Cheryshev, he couldn't find the limits of his memory. There was just nothing, no test that he could put to him that Cheryshev couldn't pass. So stories abounded around the world, and we know that Borges was an avid reader. So Borges did what Borges would tend to do with this kind of the raw fact. Oh, there's a man out there who apparently doesn't have a limit to what he can remember. And what does Borges do when he takes a raw fact like that and thinks about it? He pushes this challenge to its extremes, to its absurd extremes. So he imagines a character who had an accident. And in fact, what I recently realized that Pliny, in his Naturalis Historia, which is actually cited in this story, also refers to questions of memory, and that's one of the sections that Borges cites in this story. But that Pliny had speculated about ways that one could possibly lose the ability to forget anything. So this is also in the back of Borges's mind when he writes this. But he writes a story of a 19-year-old country bumpkin, essentially, who falls off of his horse, suffers a brain injury, and that brain injury both paralyzes him and deprives him of the ability to forget anything. which he then conceives of as a great gift, a gift of God in a way. But more than that, Borges says it deprives him of any ability to forget, in the sense of any ability not to notice. His observational ability becomes absolutely perfect. So everything that exists and that enters into the human being's sensory realm in perfect time, in 5 sensory technicolor, he can not only reproduce, but he can't fail to know it all instantaneously too. And then Borges will start to explore some of the paradoxes that arise. He'll famously say that Funes could reconstruct an entire day in his memory. And in fact, he did so on several occasions, but it takes him an entire day to reconstruct that entire day, hence begging the question of what happens to the day in which he's reconstructing the day. And these are not
Story of Tristan Shandy, which is the same kind of thing, where he's writing his own biography to the minute details. But that's in the past. Sorry.
No, but absolutely right. And and in fact, there are other stories in which, Borges will go back in time to characters or to writers like Cervantes to play around with these same kind of details and same kind of paradoxes of representation. But so, long story short, what is the paradox of representation there? The idea of the paradox of representation, as it comes forward so beautifully in this story, but also in many others, because it became an obsession of Borges, is that when we know the world, if we imagine the way that we come to know the world as taking a kind of picture of it and reproducing that picture in our mind, and we aim at perfection, the perfection of that picture would entail no longer having any knowledge whatsoever. Because if you absolutely diminish the difference between what your knowing capacity is in the world itself down to zero, you also diminish any kind of a distinction that would make you a knowing subject in the first place. So you cease to exist as someone who knows and simply become part of, immersed in the world of senses. And there is no spanning, no synthesizing, to bring in a term from one of the other 3 thinkers, over time that would allow for something like a perception or an observation to take place in the first place.
Can you explain that a bit more? Because
Yes.
there's a fundamental point here that the greater your observation, the more you've become a part of the universe in which you're observing. Is that what you're
Right, and in so doing, you actually cease to have knowledge of the universe, and so we can. Again, the best explanation comes from Borges' story himself and the jokes that he throws in there. He says Funes became increasingly irritated with the generality of the use of language around him, so that he couldn't stand the fact that people would use the word dog to refer to the 4-legged creature at 3:15 facing one direction and the four-legged creature at 3:16 facing another direction. Or he would become surprised every time he looked at himself in the mirror. But Borges is winking at us, as he often does, because how could Funes, if he purportedly had this amazing ability to only be in the moment 100% and not to abstract, which is his sort of great weakness, well, who's being irritated? Who's being surprised? In order to be surprised or irritated, you also have to have a minimum distance from that immersed nature of knowledge. You also have to, in a minute way at least, forget the itty-bitty differences that divide moments in space-time from other moments of space-time. And that's clearly, if Funes is going to be surprised, if Funes is going to be irritated at the generality of language, it's because he's not 100% immersed. He isn't just one with the world in the way that Borges or he is claiming for himself. Because to do so would be to be completely lost in the minutiae of
that's the paradox which we're talking
that's the paradox, exactly. So the idea then is I draw back from that, and with my students, we immediately see that if that is the nature of an observation, that the observation must carry within itself some kind of a distance from the world that it's observing in order to be an observation. Doesn't it make sense that Heisenberg, when he's doing the mathematical analysis that will ultimately lead to the uncertainty principle, which is the fact proven by Heisenberg that you cannot have absolutely perfect knowledge of the momentum of a particle and at the same time perfect knowledge of its location, and vice versa. You cannot have perfect knowledge of the location of a particle and have perfect knowledge of its momentum. The same kind of paradox.
The famous Heisenberg uncertainty principle.
The uncertainty principle.
It applies specifically, though, to canonical variables. In other words, position and momentum,
And
or
time and energy.
time.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And it is derived by Heisenberg purely scientifically, but then on the basis of an analysis and explanation, a mathematical explanation of measured phenomena, laboratory measurement phenomena, specifically spectrographic analyses. However, Heisenberg himself then will draw really interesting philosophical conclusions from this, the most famous being, what do we do when we do, what are we actually doing when we do science? And Heisenberg's point that he insists on over and over again is that we're not making observations of that our science doesn't consist of observations of the world as it is in itself. It consists of observations of the world, whatever the world is, as it reveals itself to our instruments of knowledge. And that this
So
is
is that the same
really important.
conclusion that you say comes from Borges as well, then?
That's right. Yeah.
It's really an attack on what we would call realism.
Yeah.
Realism that there is a real world independent of us out there, which we can know if we use our instruments and tools in order to discover what the real world is.
That's exactly
What
right.
you're saying is the conclusion we're drawing here is different.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it is not an attack on the existence of the real world. It's an attack on the fundamental knowability of the real world. That it's
Okay.
knowable in terms in and of itself is what Kant would say. Das Ding an sich, the thing in itself, that Kant says is permanently barred from our knowledge of it, which does not mean that we can't have objective scientific knowledge. On the contrary, Kant's entire system is the critical philosophy is based on the idea that philosophy's fundamental job is to put brakes on reason's natural tendency to overstep itself, precisely in order to guarantee some kind of objective scientific knowledge of the world. Objectivity is not having ultimate access to the world the way that it is in itself. Objectivity is understanding where the limits of reason are in order to be able to find a communicable and objectively verifiable science of the world. And that this is, and from Kant's perspective, utterly dependent on knowing precisely that if reason oversteps its bounds, we're going to fall into all sorts of categories of error, some of which manifest as paradoxes, is the basic idea.
Okay, so by reading Borges, we come to a conclusion that the gap between ourselves and the world is almost can I say non-existent here? That there's the difference between ourselves and the world disappears when we start understanding that the world is often created by our own observation. Is that?
I would say I would almost use what sounds like an opposed formulation, but I think that we're getting to the same point, that our cognitive capacity depends on an irreducible difference between itself and the world that it's measuring. So that irreducible difference must manifest itself. If it doesn't, there is no knowledge. So knowledge is like a map, to use another one of Borges's great mini stories. The emperor hires cartographers to go out and measure his realm. First, they come back with an enormously detailed map. It's the size of a city. The emperor rejects it, saying that it's too vague. They come back again with even larger, more detailed map, a map that's the size of one of the states of his realm. He again rejects it as being far too vague. They come back now with a map that's exactly point for point the size of his entire empire. There is no difference between the map and the empire. And the last kind of prophetic words is that the empire and the map are simply vestiges now blown around in the winds of the desert that resulted from the destruction of everything because knowledge came into perfect coincidence with the object that it's measuring. So that irreducible difference is irreducible precisely because that is what enables something like knowledge of the world to take place.
So the knowledge that we have of the world, of necessity, must be a low resolution picture, because a perfect picture would be like Borges's map.
Would cease to be a picture, would cease to be a functioning form of knowledge whatsoever, right? So low, it could even be very high resolution, but the point is it can't be perfect resolution, right? Yeah, yeah. Perfection I mean, even as I was tossing around the possibility of different titles, the idea of kind of the indelible stain in knowledge became one of the ideas that I was playing around with. That our picture of the world has an indelible imperfection in it that must be there in order for it to be useful. No, in order for it to exist as knowledge per se.
In other words, we use a low resolution picture, not a full resolution picture anyway, um, in order to be able to handle the knowledge that we have.
Right.
And if we have the full resolution, then
Yeah.
we can't handle it.
That's exactly right. And and now why does Kant? Because we haven't talked a
Yeah,
lot.
I was going to
Kant comes into the
bring him
picture, and
in.
he comes in exactly there because this is something that Kant wrestled with back and forth, and it became the pivot that launched what's called the critical philosophy. And it's the reason why it took him so many years to finally publish the Critique of Pure Reason, which consists of two fantastic and extraordinary parts: the analytic of pure reason in the first half, and the dialectic of pure reason in the second half. So what was the challenge? What was Kant wrestling with the whole time? He was wrestling with the challenge of radical empiricism that came from Scotland in the form of David Hume. And Hume, whom Kant read in translation, first not realizing it was Hume and then realizing that it was, thinking at first that it was one of his own collaborators and philosophical friends in Germany, then realizing this is actually David Hume. He read this challenge, and the challenge more or less went along the lines of every time you think that you can glean something like regular, dependable, objective, law-based scientific knowledge of the world, you're fooling yourself. That's just a kind of hubris. What you have is power of habit, built upon the fact that you get used to certain things, and you build your own subjective connections between them. And laws are nothing other than that. And we fool ourselves if we're thinking anything else. And Kant found this extremely scary, this idea. By the way, Hume did too. He found it extremely depressing. But Kant reacted and he said, I have to think about this. How could this possibly be the case? And he did say very famously that David Hume's challenge had woken him from his dogmatic slumber. And this idea of dogmatic slumber was this definitely over optimism about the possibility of gleaning the fundamental rules of the world. In fact, interpreting the entire existence of phenomena as merely an expression of ascertainable codes of reason, if you will. That's using a very kind of modern formulation, but sort of a code of codes. God's thought manifests itself in the world, in the phenomena of the world, and we read them first in the laws of mathematics. So Kant was he was a great adherent of this approach until he was flattened, if you will, by reading Hume's skepticism, and he felt he had to come up with an answer for it. And
Sorry, can I just try and clarify this point? I think it's a very important one, which may not be clear to some of our listeners. But we've got this idea of empiricism, whereby all of our knowledge comes from our experience in the world.
Yeah. And
we can
Hume
say
called
that
them
we
impressions.
know exactly what the world is because of our experience. But then Hume comes along and says, wait a minute, all of your experience comes through your senses. And the senses themselves interpret that experience that you've got and feed you information. But the senses, how can you trust that they are indeed real? And in fact, the world outside may not be real. Only the sensation of what you have is real. And therefore, he then attacked things like causality. You don't know that one thing causes another simply because we only have a perception of the senses which tell us that one thing causes another. We don't have what the thing in itself is.
That's exactly right. And since you don't have that, then not only causality, but the experience of things being where they are in space and located after each other in time, all of these things that seem fundamental to the actual building up of a scientific method are sort of illusions that we comfort ourselves with in a way, and that the piercing eye of the skeptic, like Hume, rips that all away, and we're just left with, all we have are this barrage of impressions, one after the other, that we then assuage our own anxieties by building up something like the scaffolding of the scientific method. Yeah.
So Kant thought he had an answer to Hume.
And it took him a long time to write it, but here's sort of the nub that I try to get across in the first sections of the Rigor of Angels. Kant's answer can in some ways best be illustrated by that story that we began discussing in Borges. Because what Kant's answer was essentially to say to Hume, even though he didn't have the character Funes in mind, Hume is positing something like a Funes, that all of us at heart are someone who, really what we experience fundamentally is just slivers infinitesimally thin of space-time. That's what these impressions are. And then we put them together in this way that doesn't have any rhyme or reason to it necessarily. And that's where Kant put the brakes on. And he said, no, wait a minute. I don't think we can just be people or things, impression receiving devices that only exist in the moment of what he called a unity of here and now, and then another unity of here and now, and another unity of here and now, and simply making random connections between them. Why? Because in order for us to perceive being in a unity, we already have to be synthesizing space and time prior to the arrival of these impressions. We have to have the capacity, just like Funes looking in the mirror, who claims to be surprised by his appearance at every particular moment. In order to be surprised, he actually has to also have an aspect of himself that is spanning, abstracting those differences in space-time in order for him to be irritated at our overly optimistic use of a single word dog to connect these different disparate kind of senses of impressions of four-legged animals appearing at different moments in time. No, we can't really be irritated. We can't really be surprised, as Hume would suggest we should be, because we are, in fact, depending on a prior unity that we approach the world with. And those are what Kant would then call the pure forms, the a priori forms of intuition, space, time, causality. These are necessary in order to experience those impressions in the first place. They must already be functioning. It doesn't mean that they're part of the world the way it is out there. When we create our scientific laws to explain them, we're not creating laws that explain the world as it is in itself, but we are creating laws that explain the fundamental conditions of possibility of having observations in the first place.
This is what he would call the a priori knowledge. Is that right?
That's right. And there are huge limits on a priori knowledge, but some aspect of our engagement in the world has to be anchored in such a priori knowledge, and that is what makes science possible. That's the Kantian answer to Hume. And what I suggest filters, because Kant does serve as a kind of pivot, if you will, a historical intellectual pivot between these figures. It's Kant who lived more than 100 years prior to both. It's Kant who is read by both. That leads to this triangle, if you will, between the three characters who mutually have some kind of have some sort of a mutual relation around the questions of our ability to represent reality.
So, can we? I mean, can we say something about the a priori knowledge as opposed to a posteriori knowledge, which is the knowledge that you find after examining something and looking at something? But the a priori knowledge, where does that then come from? Does that have a reality of itself, or have we created that also?
It does have a reality of itself. It is not something, if everything were simply created by individual, for example, humans, this would be then pure subjective knowledge of the kind that the idealists were suggesting was the case, the radical idealists, the German idealists. And this is exactly what Kant is rejecting.
No.
Transcendental idealism deals with what he considers to be fundamental conditions of possibility of beings who are like us, which means beings who perceive the world in space and time, who make inferences about causality. Right? What are those beings? They could be aliens. He speculates there could be human-like aliens. He imagines animal life forms that have our cognitive abilities, but it does come from being, that's one of the titles of my sections, not being God. We can't be omniscient. That's absolutely necessary for every kind of knowledge that Kant considers to be knowledge. Omniscience would be the impossible knowledge, the knowledge of that doesn't have any difference between itself and the world, and at the same time is knowledge and all-encompassing. So that kind of impossibility of being on both sides of that divide between the a priori and the a posteriori simultaneously without contradiction is what's impossible for any kind of a being that's limited in space and time who needs to come to know the world way. That's my easiest definition of how general this being could be in Kant's formula.
In other words, are you saying that if you have a system,
yeah,
if we're within that system, then we're limited to a huge degree, because you can only really describe the system if you're outside of it. When you're outside the system, you can look at all the various parts and see them independently.
That's right.
But if we're members of the system itself, we're part of that, then we cannot see the whole in its entirety because we are a part of it. And therefore we are forever limited, intrinsically limited in our knowledge of reality because we're inside it.
That's absolutely correct. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why one of the 4 sections of the book is phrased, is titled with the question, does the universe have an edge? Because that's also one of the formulations that, right, well, how would one possibly have an all-encompassing knowledge of something like the cosmos as a whole? Well, one would have to be outside of it, but the very definition of the cosmos is that it is all-encompassing. It is everything. And human knowledge, the fundamental definition, the fundamental factor determining what human knowledge is that it's not godlike knowledge. It can't possibly take that sort of a perspective. We can, and in some ways must, and automatically do, presuppose to ourselves a kind of godlike knowledge that exceeds our ability when we say things like the universe exists as a whole. Well, how could we possibly know that? Well, we can't know that, but we must presuppose that it does. And hence we presuppose a perspective on a vantage on the cosmos as a whole. And at the same time, we can't possibly, and that's where the critical philosophy comes in, we can't possibly, and we must remind ourselves that we can't possibly ever occupy that position. And so that's true of being outside of space. It's true of being prior to time. It's true of knowing every possible connection of causality from the beginning of time to the end of time. Which means it's therefore true about fundamental questions in philosophy and ethics like human freedom.
Okay, so the reality is as we sit in it or are part of it is fundamentally unknowable, and that conclusion comes to us from all three.
From all three.
Quantum mechanics, Kant's philosophy, and also Borges's literature. That fundamentally reality, we only know a part of reality.
That's it.
And we can choose, I suppose, which part we can look at, can we?
Absolutely. That's the most important thing. It's not that reality is unknowable. None of these thinkers believe that. It's that it's always fundamentally partial. Our knowledge is partial. And an interesting thing about the notion of partial in English, the idea of partial, is that it contains something that's also inherent in the way that Kant thinks about, the philosophical conclusions of the critical philosophy. Is partiality is both partial in the sense of we can never get an all-encompassing, whole, perfect view of knowledge of everything, but also as humans, we're always going to be partial to something. We're always going to lack absolutely pure impartiality, which is why the Kantian ethical philosophy is all about striving to situate ourselves as if we could attain something that no human can ultimately absolutely attain, which is perfect impartiality and judgment.
Okay. Now, there's another famous story by Borges, which you cover in your book also, called The Garden of Forking Paths.
Yeah.
That gives us a slightly different look on this. Can you say something about the story, or relate the story as to what it contains and how that impacts what we've just been saying?
Absolutely. And just to give you and your listeners, you know it already, but your listeners a little bit of the context, sort of each of these four sections of the book, and each of the four sections deal with what I was referring to as kind of one of these fundamental paradoxes, I call them, or he calls them antinomies, that Kant says we run into if we allow reason to overstep its bounds the way that reason tends to overstep its bounds. So reason wants to be able to consider the entirety of the cosmos from outside of the perspective of the cosmos, for example. So each of the sections of the book is structured around one of these. And then there's usually a core Borges story. I talk a lot about Borges's life and a lot of his different writings, but there's a core story for each of those sections. And for the last section, that core story is a remarkable piece of fiction called The Garden of Forking Paths. And Garden of Forking Paths is essentially a spy story from the First World War. And for our philosophical purposes, all the details, as interesting as they are less important than kind of the story within the story, which is that the spy in question, who's a spy of Chinese descendants working for the Prussians in England, comes upon a sinologist who in fact holds the secret to a mystery in his family's past. And that mystery had to do with where an ancestor of his disappeared to when he left the government that he was the governor of a province, and said, I'm stepping back from public life and I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to a project. And the project is twofold. I'm writing a novel and I'm building a labyrinth. And no one ever found the novel or the labyrinth. They only found scattered, almost infinite piles of papers with apparently illegible scribblings or irresolvable writings on them some way. So this sinologist has solved the mystery, and he explains that in fact the main character's ancestors' discovery, his creation, was a novel and a labyrinth, and that the novel was what he called the Garden of Forking Paths. It was an explanation, an exploration of time, not in the linear sense in which we think that we live it, but time as an infinite series of forking paths in which every decision that you make actually leads to multiple realities, and that versions of yourself inhabit all of those realities. And the reason this becomes the core story for the last section of the book is that it is really a story that allows us to think deeply about questions of free will and determinism, the sorts of questions that science today thinks about, and scientifically inclined philosophers think about when they would claim that in a world in which we don't posit the existence of something outside of the ken of physical laws, then clearly something like human freedom doesn't exist. And so this is a counterfactual test case, if you will, that's launched by Borges on this very idea. What would it mean for every decision we make, in some sense, to be nullified by the fact that we are following every path that we could take? And the interesting point is, yet again, in a sort of moment like in Funes, he points to the impossibility of that scenario, because the very knowledge that would be required for us to nullify having actually made a free choice would be a knowledge that would obviate the rules of the game, as it were. It would be a knowledge that spans precisely the unspannable. It would be a knowledge that would allow us to be in this world in which we've made this choice and also see shadows of ourselves inhabit the worlds in which we made those other choices. But the very idea of being in time, inside space, involves having irrevocably said goodbye to those other paths and those other opportunities. And that's what this story at the philosophical level is very much about. It's about regret. It's about the fact that we do live in space and time, and we do make these irrevocable choices. And no scientific fantasy about the multiverse, if you will, or forking paths into space and time as being an actual reality, which has been launched by many physicists today as a way of explaining away the paradoxes of quantum mechanics, is going to save us from the existential fact that we are condemned to making choices, and that those choices matter for our here and now.
This is the paradox, or the problem of the measurement problem, I think, in quantum mechanics, as I understand it. And as I'm sure you know, that you've got Schrodinger's cat paradox, which I think sums it up rather well. The cat as probably many people know, is in a box, and it's with a capsule that goes off. It's either alive or dead, and you don't know until you look in the box. And the solution which some people within quantum mechanics come up to is say, well, the only way to solve this problem is to know that the box exists in both states. The cat exists both alive and dead. And in fact, the universe splits up in that point to contain a live cat and a dead cat.
That's
And you
exactly.
only find yourself traveling along one of those forking paths as things
Mhm.
take place.
That's right. And mathematically it works. One has to say that this is a mathematical solution expounded out to infinity that solves the problem of the measurement problem. But um, it doesn't solve the ramifications of the equivalent of a measurement problem for human decision making and human being. And that's the point that I'm wrestling with in
I
this
think
final.
that's because we only travel one path.
We only ever, and we, by definition, us, I am that person who has chosen this path, regardless of what the speculative reaches of science says about the splitting off of universes. Whatever splits off becomes irrelevant to a here and now that is determined by a decision in this particular case that I made, or everything that led up to the me who is the me at the moment of making that decision. And what's fascinating to me in now historical philological terms is that Borges wrote this story some, I want to say, 18 years before, published the story 18 years before the great physicist who died all too young, is Hugh Everett III, who worked out that philosophical, that mathematical problem of the measurement problem in quantum mechanics, and came up with this solution, the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, that is so convincing to a small group, at least a minority group of physicists out there, including my friend and colleague Sean Carroll here at Hopkins.
Yeah.
This, I think, is what attracts people like Sean to this. Is it really, if one accepts the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, it is in fact in some ways, simple, coherent, mathematically coherent explanation that does away with the apparent paradoxes of the measurement problem. The measurement problem was already grasped by Heisenberg early on when he was coming up with, in fact, what would become quantum mechanics. And he posed it in very, very simple, straightforward terms to Wolfgang Pauli, the Viennese physicist with whom he was working at the time. He wrote him and he said, it comes down to this: the path that a particle takes doesn't exist until we've observed it. Bang. Right. That, I mean, an extraordinarily difficult thing for people who are committed to an idea of the world existing, universe existing independently, following its own paths outside of our intervention as knowing beings in it, as those who are trying to come to know the world. And certainly Schrödinger, who you just also an Austrian, who you just quoted, he came up with the scenario of the cat precisely because to show how absurd he thought this was. His idea is, what are you going to try and tell us? That the cat exists in a sort of messed up, blurred out state between alive and dead until we've opened the box and observed it? So he and Einstein were very much on the same page, coming up with thought experiments that would reveal the absurdity of what was known as the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which would simply not try to explain away any of that, but simply say, this is the calculation that you do, and this is how you end up predicting the probabilistic range of results of your spectrographic analysis of which are at the quantum level, essentially what observations are. And they could never, in fact, Einstein to his dying day could never accept that. Schrödinger did eventually accept that he had gotten it wrong, but Einstein couldn't. And all those brilliant thought experiments ultimately did lead somewhere. They led to the kinds of actual quantum mechanical experiments that have won 2 years ago Anton Zeiliger and a bunch of other great experimentalists the Nobel Prize in Physics for having demonstrated beyond any kind of doubt at this point that in fact the measurement problem is a real thing, which is why the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which at this point Sean would say is ultimately in some ways at least theoretically testable, at this point is completely untestable, exists as a mathematical explanation because it does say there is no measurement problem. As you very succinctly pointed out, Philip, it solves the problem by saying, well, either the cat is dead in the universe that you find yourself in, or the cat is alive. But it's also the opposite in the other universe. Yeah.
So, are we saying that, for example, the natural understanding of reality, the kind of understanding that you mentioned Einstein had, a kind of clear-cut universe in which we find ourselves in, the idea that, as Einstein said, God does not play dice in this universe. It's merely that we haven't understood it enough yet, but it's out there for us to understand. Are we saying that that is not the actual case? That intrinsically the universe is such that we cannot understand it, and basically the Copenhagen interpretation is the one that's got it right, which basically said, don't try to understand it.
Yeah, I mean, as you know from having read the book, I end up siding with or finding great affinity with an interpretation that's out there right now, which is the one that's been advanced by the Italian physicist Carlo Rovelli, which is known as the relational interpretation of quantum mechanics. And basically it says, if you understand all observations as, in fact, existence itself as being composed of relations primarily, as opposed to unique individuals who first exist and then enter into relations, all of the problems of the measurement problem disappear, because you understand that what is fundamental is a relationship between items, and that the singularity of those items, the singularity of those individuals, is derivative of relationships themselves. And this is actually what occurred famously, because that's how he begins. The thought occurred to us. That's how he begins his 1925 paper that won him the Nobel Prize and that led to the discovery and the invention of quantum mechanics. That's exactly what Heisenberg begins that paper by saying, is it occurred to me to start treating these observations of particles as in effect, what are called Fourier relations or Fourier sequences. And that's a mathematical model used to examine the relations between for example, the best way is to think about it is a vibrating violin string, where an imaginary point and the speed and frequency of an imaginary point on a vibrating string would be based on other variables that you put into it. Philosophically, the idea would be it's the vibration, it's the movement, it's the relationship that comes first, and then from that you derive the character of the point that you are inferring exists as a result of this relationship. That move freed him from the paradoxes that were grinding everyone to a stop when they were trying to figure out how is it that every time we try to measure the location of an electron, it seems that it ends up being somewhere else, or our measurement of that electron actually changes what's going to happen next. Well, he says that's because the measurement is part of the relationship that's leading to the inference of where the electron is. You start with relations; they're more fundamental. Individuals are inferred from relations.
There are a number of interpretations of quantum mechanics now. We've mentioned at least three here. So we've got the Copenhagen interpretation, which says that reality is basically unknowable in its essence. We've got the Everett Wheeler multi-world interpretation, and Carlo Rovelli's relational interpretation. I did want to throw one more in because I feel some allegiance to David Bohm's interpretation, which is the causal interpretation or the ontological interpretation, which is very interesting. And the only reason I know much about that is because I actually worked in the same department with Bohm and did my PhD there. But he also takes the view that it's not an epistemological knowledge. It's not really a knowledge of the world that we have, but ontological. We can know where the position of the particle is exactly at any particular point and its momentum, but there's this quantum field which governs everything. So it's a different way of looking at it.
Another way of looking at it, and I think I've read somewhere that there is about a total of 7
yes, at least I would think.
That's right, out there that each have their adherents. I talk about another one. I don't talk about Bohmian mechanics much in this. Hidden variables is another, and
Yeah.
Um, oh,
But,
the
but that brings us
spontaneous collapse is another that I mentioned in passing. Yeah.
that brings us to a particular question I wanted to ask, and that is, you mention in the book what we'll call metaphysical prejudice. You use that term, metaphysical prejudice, and I'm wondering if that connects with the very various different interpretations that we've got. Are these forms of metaphysical prejudice, and is that what you meant by it when you were discussing it? What does it mean, and how does Borges and Heisenberg and Kant shed light on that?
It's really the core of everything we're talking about here. If you come into your observations about the world, if you come into your scientific experiments with a prefixed idea about how the world must be, and then you resist interpretations based on the observations that you get, or you try to fit them into a particular box because that must be how the world is, that would be the definition of a metaphysical prejudice. So the Einsteinian metaphysical prejudice that led him, despite being the most brilliant man of the 20th century, that led him to resist what ultimately was revealed to be the case, and that his thought experiments really did pave the way to finding out. It's because he was, despite having really ripped the rug out from metaphysical prejudices about space and time in 1905 and 1915 with the relativity theories, he had a metaphysical commitment to the way the world must be, that things exist out there in space and time, smoothly connected by space and time, in a way that is independent of anything like an observation, taking them into account. That there isn't such thing as sort of strange quantum in discreteness, right? That everything is in fact smooth, and that relations evolve smoothly in space and time. These are, in fact, not observationally supported theories. They are something like an idea about the way the world must be that Einstein and Schrödinger brought with them. They, in part, this has to do with beauty. They thought that a world that, if you increased your resolution of your picture of the world, got down to a point where it was, to use a terminology of today, highly pixelated, where you're not finding a smooth reality, but one that's all jumpy and filled with discontinuities. They found this idea to be ugly, to be in some ways repulsive, and they didn't believe that reality could be that way. Or, as you just quoted him famously saying about the Copenhagen interpretation, because of Max Born's extraordinary contribution, ultimately is a probabilistic interpretation. What we can know are the probability of outcomes of our experiments. Has he famously responded to that? No. The old one doesn't throw dice, and it doesn't play dice with the universe. This is not the case. This is a limitation of our knowledge, but not of the way that the world is in itself. So that, whether right or wrong, and I think history has proved that that prejudice in this particular case was unfortunately the incorrect one, that is a prejudice, right? You're entering into your experimental relationships with the world already, in some sense, having an idea of how the world is going to turn out to be. So many of these interpretations of quantum mechanics in the end, and this, it's not my term, I'm really borrowing it from Rovelli, do suffer from this metaphysical prejudice. And Rovelli's point is that you can have a perfectly coherent explanation of what seems paradoxical about quantum mechanics if you just put aside your prejudices about what reality must be.
Is it possible to approach or to approach reality without a metaphysical prejudice of some kind? Are we not conditioned some way or other, even if we were to dispense with one metaphysical prejudice? Does that not involve picking up another one, because you can't approach the world without it? Or
I think yeah, this is an excellent question. I think you're probably, the implication in your question is probably correct, that we do have a tendency to have metaphysical prejudices. I think that's the whole point of Kant's critical philosophy, is to try and ward us off against very natural metaphysical prejudices.
Well, I was going to ask you this as well,
Yeah.
because I'm not too sure of the answer to this, but what is there a connection between metaphysical prejudice and a priori knowledge, which Kant, of course, championed?
Yes, and I'll give you a perfect example of it. Absolutely, there is, and it's a question of where do you draw your line between something that Kant would say is truly a priori and where you've let your a prioris be colored by, if you will, a posteriori knowledge. And Kant got that one wrong, and he got that one wrong in the following way. He thought that the space and time that are, and I still believe correctly in my reading of Kant, conditions of possibility of knowing the world had certain characteristics to them. One is that time ticked off in a very regular way, and that space was flat, empty, and infinitely three-dimensional. These, and this is, Heisenberg's point in saying he got the a prioris wrong, and I believe I agree with Heisenberg here, were already demonstrated to be false in 1915. Time already false in 1905 with Einstein's first paper on relativity, and the second paper in 1915 showed that not only was time variable and nothing like a pure instantaneous simultaneous moment can be said to exist independent throughout the universe, independent of our observations. But that space itself does bend, and that the bending of space is, in fact, what we perceive as gravity. This would be unthinkable to Kant. So Kant clearly did, in his a prioris, right, the a priori forms of intuition that were space, time, and causality, make a mistake. He allowed his a posteriori experience of space and time to color the nature of the a prioris that he imported in there. So I think, to go back to your very good question, I think it's extremely unlikely that we can rid all of our knowledge of some sort of metaphysical prejudice. And I guess in some ways that shouldn't be the point, but rather to keep our guard up and be aware of our tendency to fall into metaphysical prejudice, lest it lead us into error.
Okay. We're coming to the end of our time, William, and I have one last question for you, really, and that is, where does that really leave us? I mean, particularly as individuals, as we grapple with our own place in reality.
Yeah.
I mean, Kant moved into ethics. How do we view the world in which we live as a knowable or an unknowable situation? How does it affect our behavior, or should it affect our the way that we live? What's your final conclusions on that?
My final conclusions can be boiled down into a reminder to constantly be aware or to temper our relations with the world, our relations with each other, our relations with ultimately the things that we can know, with something like epistemic humility. That any of us at any time is very likely to be tempted to claim to know more than we possibly can know. We're going to be tempted to import models of how the world must or should be into our engagements with the phenomena of the world. We're going to be tempted to decide in advance how relations among people should be, rather than being open to difference. And I think epistemic humility is especially when I think about the world as it is right now, and the overreach of politics, the tendency to rush to judgment. I think epistemic humility is a kind of lesson that can benefit humans in all sorts of walks of life.
We live in a world where we're all so sure about everything, and your
Right.
comment really is a salient one, that maybe we should not be quite so arrogant about what we know. Is that fair enough?
That is very fair. That is very fair. Yeah.
William Egginton, thank you ever so much for a fascinating conversation on these topics. Let me just remind you again, the Rigor of Angels, Borges, Heisenberg, Kant, and the Ultimate Nature of Reality, available. It's I'm not sure the price of it. I got it mine from Amazon, and fully available there. And an excellent weaving together of the three characters, their lives, and also their principles and the philosophy which undergirds them. Thank you. Thank you very
Thank
much
you,
indeed.
Philip. Oh, and let me also just quickly mention to you, and I don't know if this is useful to your listeners at all, but the edition you were showing me is the Penguin Random House edition from the United States. But there's a very beautiful tomato-colored edition that's been out in the UK from Pushkin Press, which is now available in Waterstones and all of the London booksellers. So
I've not seen that one. I got
pick
mine
those up. Yeah.
like a lot of people do. But thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Philip.